Good morning again, everyone. My name is Patrice Wallen, and I'm a program consultant for the Great Plains Institute, and I work with our carbon management team on all things carbon capture. You are joining the third in a learning webinar series for the CO2 transport infrastructure MOU states. In the first two webinars, we covered the broad federal landscape of policies and the like relating to carbon capture and infrastructure. In the second webinar, we heard from representatives with the Wyoming Pipeline Corridor Initiative and also the Alberta Trunk Line. And today we are going to hear from the states of Wyoming and Louisiana on where things stand for them relative to carbon capture and issues of importance to this group, and also have a brief update on some federal legislation related to infrastructure and an overview of announced projects relating to carbon capture since the passage of 45Q. Just as a reminder, the webinar is being recorded. We will try to leave ample time for Q&A at the end of the webinar, and you are welcome to use the chat box to submit questions throughout the webinar, and we will be fielding those as staff and getting those back to our speakers. Next slide. So our speakers today, an esteemed group, and I will just be briefly introducing them all at once here before moving into their presentations. So we have Deepika Nagabhushan with us today, and she leads the Clean Air Task Force's Decarbonized Fossil Energy Program. She has a breadth of knowledge and experience in carbon capture, and she's going to lay out for us the project landscape on carbon capture. We also have Dr. Stephen Carpenter, who is the head of the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute in Wyoming, and Steve is no stranger to this group, and so I'll leave his biographical introduction at that. And also we are joined today by Jason Langklow, and he is with the Louisiana Department of Natural Resources. He serves as the director of the State Energy Office there and also of the Technology Assessment Division. And Brad Crabtree, who is the Vice President of Carbon Management at the Great Plains Institute, and also the staff director of the Carbon Capture Coalition, is going to share with us an update on some federal infrastructure legislation. Next slide. Just as a reminder, the states that have officially signed on to the CO2 transport infrastructure MOU are Kansas, Louisiana, Maryland, Montana, Oklahoma, Wyoming, and Pennsylvania. And we are actively in discussions with other states, doing outreach, providing education, answering questions about the MOU. And so we're still hopeful that additional states will join this effort. The MOU went into effect on October 1st. Next slide, Lauren. And kind of the first course of action, or the largest undertaking, will be the development of an action plan for CO2 transport infrastructure. And our charge is to complete that within a year's time, so to release that in October 2021. So this learning webinar series is aimed at providing information to help inform that process. Next slide. And the fourth and final webinar in this learning series will be next Thursday, December 17th. And at that time, we will be reviewing potential topics and areas that we will be planning to cover in an action plan, and also reviewing how we'll undertake that work in 2021. So please join us for that webinar as well. Next slide. So without any delay, I'd like to turn things over to Deepika so she can share with us the landscape of projects across the U.S.
Thanks, Patrice. Hi, everybody. I'll just do an overview of all the projects that we've seen public announcements for, and just sort of do a little analysis of like what that tells us. What picture do we sort of see in terms of where they are, in terms of status, or what kind of projects there are, and what that means for just, the kind of policies we might need going forward. Next slide, please, Lauren. So earlier this year, a CATF launched an interactive map, and that's the image that you see on this screen. And it's sort of like a map that you can sort of, switch on and off different controls, like you can see it by sector, you can see it by storage type, and you can switch on and off each of these individual legend keys. And so you can sort of look at it for yourself. We can share the link in the chat box later, but this is just sort of an image of that. And so when the map was released, there were close to 32 projects in the pipeline and had been announced publicly. And that included those that had received feed study grants from the Department of Energy, or had received some media coverage, or had actually made announcements and press releases. So it was sort of a collection of all those pieces of information that we put together into this map. Since then, just September of this year, we've seen some additional feed grants being awarded by the Department of Energy. So those don't appear on the map yet, but I just wanted to say that that does bring our total up to 36, but that should be appearing on the map shortly. In terms of like when the announcements came, what we've seen is that we did see some announcements directly right after like the 2018 passage of 45Q, but a bulk of them came the following year in 2019. And then some have come even in 2020. But just a little disclaimer, we don't have a lot of, we don't have all the details for all the projects. So this analysis is just based on the public information that we do have available. Next slide, please, Lauren. Okay, so first sort of, way of slicing this data I thought would be good was to sort of look at it by storage type. There's two storage types mainly. One is when a project decides to store this captured CO2 in a saline storage formation, or the second option would be if they had partnered with an enhanced oil recovery operator to store CO2 via enhanced oil recovery operations, and enhanced oil recovery operations that have a specific intention of getting an MRV or already have an MRV approved under the EPA. So just want to make sure that this is very much about storage in following the rules that the EPA has laid out. So it looks like we've got more saline projects than we've got projects trying to do EOR. We've got about 17 doing saline or have announced that they will do saline, and 11 that are planning to do EOR projects. Of the ones that are doing saline, it's an important thing to I guess, recognize that 7 of them are carbon safe projects under the Department of Energy, meaning that they've been funded to advance assessment of the storage opportunities or understand the storage potential of those sites and basins. And then 11 projects that are doing EOR are out of that, around 5 are in Texas. So sort of highlighting the value of existing infrastructure for some projects and the need for them to sort of plug into existing sites or existing pipelines. So that's an interesting, observation when projects are trying to sort of figure out their business model. There are 4 that we don't know what they're doing yet. Next slide, please. In terms of sector breakdown, what we're seeing is we're seeing about 15 projects in the power sector. We're seeing about 20 projects in the industrial sector and 1 direct air capture project so far. I've also sort of listed down just sort of the breakdown within the power sector. We have a lot of gas, out of which, pretty much half of those were funded by DOE feed studies. They are probably most of them are in feed stage right now because of that feed grant. 6 coal plants that are trying to do CCS, and out of that, 5 of them have received funding for feed studies under the DOE program. 1 is a BECCS plant and 1 is a waste to energy plant. With industrial sector, we've got a whole bunch of ethanol, 6 of them. 2 of them have received feed grants from the Department of Energy. 3 cement plants. This is really exciting. 2 of them actually were announced this year. So those were the two that got the Department of Energy grant to do feed. 1 steel plant, also the same case, which is that they received the feed grant this year from the Department of Energy. This is really exciting because these are the kind of projects that will be very important in terms of having no other option to decarbonize apart from doing CCS. We've got 2 plants that are doing hydrogen, and 3 gas processing plants, and 5 that are sort of like split, between multiple types like biochemicals and petrochemicals and those kinds of, and there are some that we don't exactly know what kind of industrial project, but just that we know that they are industrial sector projects. Next slide, please. In terms of project status, it's really important to remember that while these announcements are great, and it sort of really shows the value of 45Q in advancing project interest in the private sector, it is important to know that we are still in the early stages for most of the projects. About 26 projects are still within the feed or pre-feed state, and that is very early on because this is the first thing you do when you're looking to develop a project. And out of those 26 that are in those stages, 15 of them are doing so because they applied for a DOE grant and received them. And that's close to about $150 million of funding from the Department of Energy in just the last 2 years. And then we have about 8 projects that we don't really know the status. I would assume that they're also in early stages. There are 2 projects that have announced that they are in advanced stages and have finished a lot of engineering work and are in talks with investors. And of course, that's sort of stuck there because we know that we still need a lot of IRS finalization of the guidelines. So that's also an important thing to remember in terms of what affects these projects moving forward in their development stages. Next slide, please. So I wanted to sort of, kind of talk a little bit about business model observations just from all these projects that we've, sort of looked at and these project announcements that we've had. The interesting thing is that there are some projects that are overlapping between eligibility within under 45Q and eligibility under LCFS over in California. So about 5 projects, I would say, if I've got the number right, around 5 projects I think are sort of building their business model based on both of these incentive programs and are able to take advantage of both of them. But most of the projects still are waiting for 45Q modifications to really move forward on the financing and just sort of advancing in their stages of development. Having had conversations with developers, that's direct pay and extension of commenced construction seem to be across the board very important for advancing those projects forward and really knowing that they're actually going to be eligible for 45Q. And for gas plants specifically, the analysis that CATF has done, what we've found is that 45Q itself may be quite, may not appropriately compensate a gas plant just the way that it would for a coal-fired power plant, just because coal-fired power plant makes more CO2 than a gas-fired power plant. And because 45Q awards, and it's an incentive per ton, it sort of undercompensates gas in that respect. But what CATF has found in the analysis is that if there was a way to access the same 45Q credit, but just in the form of $1 per megawatt hour, that could change the game for gas-fired CCS projects to appropriately compensate them. So this is one of the ways we think that these stages can be helped to advance into further stages of development. Another observation on business model is that most of these projects are a single source and single sink project. So when there's a project announced, there is sort of, they have a single idea of like, okay, this project will take its CO2 and put it in this sink. There is not a clear view as to whether or not there are project developers that are talking to each other and are trying to work with each other to try and create a joint or common storage infrastructure that would be serving as a sink for multiple capture projects. which would de-risk. If that was the case, it would de-risk the projects, because what we've seen with a recent decision on mothballing for Petronova, we know that if one sink stops functioning, then the capture project also has to stop functioning, because there is nowhere else for the CO2 to go. That is risky when it comes to meeting our climate goals. So this would be something we need to start sort of talking about and start to see what we need to do to allow these projects to adopt a de-risked business model of having multiple sources matched with multiple sinks, potentially sharing infrastructure for transport that will sort of de-risk all the pieces of the business of the whole system. But I do want to point out two things. One project that is announced on the Gulf Coast, in the Gulf Coast area, it's Occidental, called LAC Sequest. And we don't know a lot about this project yet, but just that it aims to be a pure play geologic storage project, hoping to accept CO2 from multiple industrial sources in the vicinity. So that could be a really interesting demonstration of this business model when it advances. Another one is Southern Company. This is an interesting one because it is still Southern Company trying to store CO2 from 3 of their own capture projects, which all got some form of DOE funding. But I'm not yet sure whether or not this project will start to think about accepting CO2 from other projects that are not owned by Southern nearby. So that's a question, but it's still an opportunity that I thought I'll highlight because it's sort of an interesting, there will be a lot of storage capability in those basins that they're targeting. Then, and another thing CATF is thinking about that I want to sort of highlight here is that as more and more projects start to go into the same storage basins, specifically saline storage basins, if there are projects nearby targeting the same basin from different sites, there will need to be some sort of a framework we'll have to develop, some sort of a coordination, information sharing kind of framework that will allow us to identify and mitigate risks that are posed by the geology itself, which means that, you know, when there are more projects sort of pumping into, injecting CO2 into the same basin, there could be risks, if not checked, of overlapping pressure fronts or CO2 plumes interacting underground. So these kinds of risks need to be understood while we scale up. It may not be an issue right away because we may see, faraway projects or like they're not super close by, but if they are, then there will need to be some framework with which we can optimize the usage of the storage resource within a basin. We also would like to optimize the usage of surface infrastructure, but also we want to maximize permanence and safety while we're doing that. So I just want to sort of leave that also on here for people to think about. And it is something that CATF is thinking about, and we're working on some ideas of like how this might work and what kind of business models could enable this kind of coordination and sort of oversight. And that's something we're hoping to sort of come out with maybe in the next few months. So just want to leave you all with those thoughts there. And I think that is the last slide I have.
Thanks, Deepika. And just given time, I think we're going to move into other presentations and hold Q&A for the end of the webinar. So next slide, Lauren, please. And I'm pleased to turn it over to Dr. Stephen Carpenter to share Wyoming Perspective. Steve.
Thank you, Patrice. Next slide, Lauren. Next slide. So when we talked about planning this, we wanted to share with you what some individual states are doing. And Jason, we'll talk about Louisiana next. I was asked to share what did we do and what will we do in Wyoming relative to Class 6. What I've shared with you here is some historical work that was done by the legislature to address pore space ownership, permitting procedures for a CCUS site, post-closure MRV for oil and gas operating state unitization is important. Wyoming is a natural resource extraction state, so it's very important that we deal with liability, or more importantly, not have storage rights circumvent production rights. And you can see that the legislature dealt with both of those issues and provided a mechanism for CO2 EOR. Ultimately, those changes, along with a lot of work by a lot of people, culminated in the state of Wyoming getting primacy for UIC Class 6 on August 31st this year. Next slide. What are we going to do in this upcoming session? We are, next slide, Lauren. We have a huge budget deficit, which is going to dominate the session. But we have created, the legislature was mindful and merged the Wyoming Pipeline Authority. You've heard Matt Fry, who's no stranger to this organization, present about Pipeline Corridor Initiative in Wyoming, merged the pipeline and the infrastructure into a new Wyoming Energy Authority. The biggest takeaway from that is that the legislature gave them $3 billion with a B capacity to build out infrastructure. In this session, they're going to deal with a few tweaks. Obviously, in the Energy Authority is oil, gas, coal, but they're going to tweak it to deal with some rare earths and some other issues. And many of you may know Dr. Glenn Morrell. Glenn was formerly with the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute some time ago, left and was with Baker Hughes and GE, and he has been selected as the inaugural director of the Wyoming Energy Authority. And I'll mention his name here again in a moment, but if you don't know Glenn, or you do know Glenn, the Energy Authority is going to drive much of this work. I think the last big piece that's going to happen legislatively, and it's a misnomer because it's going to happen on the rules making side, is House Bill 200, which is Wyoming's low carbon energy standard. Passed the legislative body last year, and now is in the position for the Public Service Commission to write the rules, which they expect to do in 2021. And they've already begun and reached out to folks at SER like Kip Coddington and others to help figure out what that actual process needs to look like. Next slide, please. So where are we on our update? As they indicated, we received primacy in August. Our application went in January. The EPA acknowledged it in April, and we got it in August. Certainly are grateful to our friends to the Northeast in North Dakota who took years to do that. It's hopeful that any learnings that we have here can shared with our friends to the Southeast. Jason can shorten this time frame from 9 months down to something less, and hopefully weeks. I'm not sure that'll happen, but anything we can do to help, we hope does help. How many permits do we have? We don't have any, but we know that some are coming. Many of you are aware that UW has a Carbon Safe Phase 3 project at the Dry Fork Station. One of the tasks in that is to prepare and submit an application for construction of a Class 6 well. That application is due mid-year next year. And Glenn Morrell has this wonderful idea in the same notion that you've heard Matt Fry talk about pre-permitting Wyoming pipeline corridors. Wyoming is a relatively progressive state, being the first state in the union to allow women to vote, being the first jurisdiction anywhere in the world to pre-permit carbon dioxide pipelines. We are now in conversations to pre-permit Class 6 wells. This idea has been discussed with DEQ, and they're very much in favor of it. And so Glenn, I'm going to coin for Glenn SFS, sequestration for service. Wyoming is contemplating drilling some wells and offering sequestration service for hire. And so we're very open to this group and others if they have ideas or thoughts on how that goes. Next slide. These are the technical requirements that came out of our primacy application. They're very similar to the federal requirements, just listing here of the 13 things that have to go through. Obviously, our carbon safe phase 1 and phase 2, we're doing that. Obviously, if Glenn advances the sequestration for service, we'll have to do these pieces as part of whatever wells we permit. One of the things that the legislature did do in our primacy is allow an application fee. And given the environment that we're in with federal EPA retirements and loss of institutional knowledge that many of us have talked about for the larger group, we in Wyoming have to look internally and say, do we have the staff to do this? Currently, we do, but the legislature allowed us to charge a fee, a nominal fee, so that the state can go out and hire consultants if they need to for specialty issues like evaluation of seismic or geophysics that we may have had a retirement and don't have an individual inside. The expectation is we can go out and get that service through DEQ and not hold up and delay a permit and be able to charge reasonable cost to move that forward. So there shouldn't be any delays. Next slide. So why is Wyoming participating in this effort that Patrice and Brad have talked about in the Regional Deployment Initiative and this MOU? We're a first mover. As I said before, the Pipeline Authority, with a decade of work by Matt Fry to get both pipelines in place and pre-permitted corridors. Transportation is important to us, and we realize doing it alone is more difficult than doing it with our friends. And so our neighbors, both to the north and to the south, we believe we can do a lot. And this MOU, next slide, that Patrice has talked about, this, the focus of this discussion, the state of Wyoming is very supportive of. There's a lot of pieces in there, but the 4 takeaways for us is the ability to engage with stakeholders regionally, to help get outside expertise to help put together this regional plan and identify recommendations for that, and ultimately to build out infrastructure, which is our ultimate goal. So we are very excited to be participating with this group, and we'll answer any questions at the end of the show, and or reach out individually to talk about anything we can do to help. Thank you, Patrice.
Hey, Steve, I'm going to throw one question to you quickly, just
Sure.
because it's relevant to your presentation, and that is, who owns the pore space in Wyoming?
Typically, the surface owner owns the pore space. Now, Wyoming is a bit unique in that we have significant amount of federal land and state land, but they have the landowner, the surface right owner owns the pore space in the state of Wyoming.
Hey, Steve. This is
Great,
Jeff.
thank you for that, Steve. And I would just also like so we're going to hold other questions to the end, I think, but I just wanted to point out, for those of you who had Zoom difficulties, and I understand that there were several at the start of the webinar, we are recording this, and we will certainly share that link back out so that you can see whatever portion of Deepika's presentation you weren't able to take in. So we apologize for the Zoom technical problems. But without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Jason Langlow, our esteemed colleague down in Louisiana, who I'm sure will share a great update on what's happening down in the Gulf Coast. Jason.
Hey, good morning, Patrice. Thanks for the opportunity, and Great Plains for hosting this today, and for everyone taking time out of their busy schedules to listen about the importance of the MOU and infrastructure. And I'd like to start this morning just to hit on a couple of those themes. So Dr. Carpenter and Deepika both talked about projects, and they both talked about collaboration. And I think that one of the things that you'll notice as your state is progressing through this, or your company, is that that's going to continue to be just an absolutely important theme in order to advance projects. And I think that when Louisiana first started looking at CCUS as a potential, we fully recognized that there were going to be some economic challenges, and that the state would not be able to come out of the gate and have state incentives that directly supported 45Q. One of the things that we didn't anticipate at the time was obviously COVID and its devastating effects on state budgets, as Dr. Carpenter mentioned as well. And one of the things that we're starting through right now, and that we're extremely fortunate and really glad that we did, was just really focus a lot on the regulatory aspects of CCUS, and trying to make sure that our focus was on making sure that states and other folks who want to come in and do projects have a very clear pathway, and also have just a lot of direction from the state and a staff who's going to be supportive in order to get those projects off of the ground. So we have progressed very well in that respect. We have a great team who's working in our Office of Conservation that's really trying to advance primacy. And as we've seen many times, that process takes some time. And North Dakota, on average, took a little bit over 6 years, and Wyoming took almost a time frame that was a lot less than that, but still it took a long time. And we fully saw that in order for us to get 45Q and to get projects in Louisiana, we needed to shorten that time frame. And our work has really focused on building a successful and strong relationship, and continuing that relationship with our federal partners at the Environmental Protection Agency. And our staff has really focused on strengthening that relationship and making sure that we obviously are pursuing primacy, but once we do get it, that we're ready to hit the ground running. So we're in the process of actually doing this next legislative session, where we're going to request additional staff. That was part of the original legislation that Louisiana had back in 2009 that kind of set up the Gulf Coast Sequestration Act, and for us to start early development of a program. We've taken a lot of the pieces of that original legislation and tried to hash through how do we grow that into a successful carbon management economy for the state. And I think that one of the things that we're starting to see now is that our political leaders and our governor has really looked at carbon management and the overall CCUS as one of the key pieces to achieve overall climate goals for the state. He recently announced, Governor Edwards recently announced a climate initiatives task force in Louisiana, which we're a very industrial state. We have a tremendous amount of tax revenue that comes from manufacturing and from our oil and gas industries. So we have a lot of carbon dioxide emissions. We're actually second only to Texas in industrial emissions. We're somewhere in the neighborhood of a little over 200 million tons per year just on our CO2 emissions on the industrial side. So there's a significant amount of opportunity for us to do this. And I think that the governor's initiative and that climate initiative task force works very well with some of the work that we're doing on CCUS. And we've had the kickoff meeting and are getting ready to start individual committee meetings. And one of the things that we've seen come very true to form is the collaboration that's occurring not only among the state agencies, but that's happening with the state agencies, with industry, and with our NGOs. And that's something that I think that the Carbon Capture Coalition has already done very well. One of the things that I was most impressed with when I first started getting into this work was how bipartisan and how many different folks are at the table trying to advance this type of technology. And I think that for us, that was very telling because we wanted to participate in this and to grow it as an industry, but we're actually starting to see that. And the reason I say that is that within the last 6 to 12 months, we meet with people anywhere from a small oil and gas operator all the way up to the oil and gas majors and manufacturing majors. And that to me has shown us that this is an industry that not only appeals to large manufacturers, but it appeals to just about every dynamic of folks who are operating in the state of Louisiana. On top of that, we had a recent project announcement in West Louisiana by a company called Gulf Coast Sequestration that has actually privately developed and a permitted acreage in West Louisiana to inject up to 300 million tons per year of CO2. All private development. They're very advanced, and they've actually filed the first Class 6 permit that's been filed in Louisiana. We fully anticipate in the next several months to get several more permits filed. Right now, those are going to EPA. And again, our office staff and conservation, Laura Corey, Kelly and Steve Lee and his staff have been working very hard with EPA to make sure that we're ready to really start to look at the reviews and work through a lot of those details. We're in the process right now. We've gone through the crosswalk with EPA on our regulations to make sure that everything is in line. And right now we're anticipating hopefully getting primacy in the next 14 to 16 months. So that's extremely exciting for us, and we're really pushing hard to make that happen. We are going, as soon as we can get back in front of folks, we're going to continue our work we originally started with Oklahoma and Wyoming. I talked to Secretary Wagner this morning. We've continued to keep the relationships with EPA that we've built, and we fully anticipate that is going to continue, and that EPA is going to fully support this becoming an industry for our state and being successful. So project development for us is extremely exciting. I think that that is what our number one goal is, to bring developers and to bring the economics back to Louisiana to help folks and operators turn this into a business and to be successful, and to see the amount of storage capability, or the amount of storage capacity, I should say, that's available in Louisiana and Texas. We're trying to work with our partners to the west and make sure that they're ready for this hopefully this big uptick in projects. So with that, I'll shift just a little bit to where we're going now and where our focus is. And obviously we have a lot of time and resources that's focused on primacy, but I do want to articulate how important the need for infrastructure is for not only Louisiana, but for every state that's looking at CCUS as a potential opportunity. We hear from developers just about every week, and we visit with our federal delegates as well, and just stress the importance of how important things like the SCALE Act and other things are in order to facilitate development. We have a lot of people that have tremendous source and a lot of material and a lot of CO2 that they want to move, but they need pipelines and they need infrastructure in order to do that. And I think that we're very close to getting a lot more project announcements, but I think that the focus that needs to happen on infrastructure is absolutely critical. And I think that for us, that remains one of our top priorities, is to work with the Carbon Capture Coalition and other partners to make sure that emphasis stays there. And I think that as we follow through this process, we need to make sure that all those facilities that want to either move CO2 or to inject it have the necessary resources and capability in order to do that, to implement these projects. So through this whole pandemic, I think that the thing that's kept a lot of us going is that, just the continued communication that we've had with a lot of companies and a lot of people who are interested in doing CCUS projects. I know for me, that's been one of the highlights, is to keep in touch with folks and to see companies who are looking at this as a long-term progressive technology that they want to bring to the state. And again, I think working with all the folks on the line and our state partners and the working groups, that's something that has really helped to set the stage for where we are now. And I want to just compliment the GPI and the coalition for continuing to put these working groups together and pursue things like the MOU, and just to continue to get folks to focus on infrastructure and collaboration, and to make sure that we keep working together toward that common goal. So thanks for the opportunity for having us today. Always happy to talk about what's going on in Louisiana, and I'll see you guys soon.
Jason, thank you so much for sharing that Louisiana perspective, and we really appreciate your engagement and partnership. Next slide, Lauren, and I will now turn it over to Brad Crabtree, who is going to give us a brief update on where things stand with federal infrastructure legislation. Thanks, Brad.
Great, thank you, Patrice, and thanks everyone for joining us. It's a great turnout. I'm going to just give you a heads up about a very exciting legislative effort that will be very supportive, if enacted, very supportive of the infrastructure efforts you're undertaking in the context of the Memorandum of Understanding and its implementation. Next slide. Let me just, this isn't on the slide, but let me just give a little bit of history in the context of this regional work we've been doing with all of you now in different ways for 5 years. In 2017, the state carbon capture work group prepared kind of a first ever white paper on CO2 transport deployment. Some of you have seen some of the potential pipeline corridors that were developed in that early effort, and made recommendations to Congress for the development of large-scale CO2 transport infrastructure, and to make sure that CO2 infrastructure was part of federal infrastructure policy. And that was kind of the starting point for what then evolved into the modeling that the regional deployment modeling that was presented to all of you in a previous webinar, showing, from Appalachia to the Rockies and in Canada to the Gulf Coast. And this legislation I'm about to talk about is kind of the culmination of that whole process of policy development, in terms of having a foundational federal bill to provide the federal component of financing that infrastructure. And what we're trying to accomplish here is to really expand the federal focus from what has appropriately been on incentives to finance carbon capture at industrial facilities and power plants, the reform and expansion of the 45Q tax credit, to now with comparable prioritization address the infrastructure side. And I think I don't need to talk with all of you about the benefits of this infrastructure deployment. But I think one of the key things to highlight, in addition to what's on the slide, is that regardless of the type of infrastructure, if you look historically, there's always a chicken and egg challenge with building out large scale infrastructure. Somebody has to start. Actually, multiple parties have to start at the same time. In our case, the various industries and facilities that want to capture and manage their CO2, they need to have the confidence that there will be CO2 transport solutions available to them before they undertake the commitments and the capital investments required for capture projects. Similarly, on the geologic storage end and the pipeline development end, if there are companies interested in making those investments and developing those projects, they need to be reassured that the supply of CO2 and shippers willing to pay to transport that CO2 will be available. And that's where really where the federal government needs to come in and kind of break that chicken and egg logjam that we all face in this work together. The other important component is that we need to build ahead of demand. We've talked about that before. We want to make sure that the CO2 transport infrastructure that's put in place not only accommodates the capture projects that are under development now, but also additional projects in the future deployment pipeline. Next slide. So the SCALE Act is intended to be kind of the first comprehensive legislation to tackle that challenge in two fundamental areas. One, the financing and cost share for the development of the CO2 transport infrastructure itself, but tying that with the scaling up of the large-scale saline geologic storage that we've been talking about today. And so you see on this slide the various key components of the SCALE Act. And the first is the cost share I mentioned. And that cost share has both the first component is the storage side, and that's providing the cost share for the development of large-scale saline geologic storage hubs. And there's a reservoir characterization component to that. There's a permitting component, but there needs to be a federal role in scaling that up and building on what is already being done through DOE and by many of you involved in the carbon safe projects. And of course, we've been talking about this extensively. This legislation incorporates the very permitting priorities that Jason and others were just talking about, so that whether it's at the federal level with EPA or states taking on primacy, that there's the capacity and the staffing to make sure that we can be responsive to the permit applications that come forward. The third piece is, for those of you who are familiar with federal infrastructure policy, you've probably heard of WIFIA, which is for water. I'm sure you've heard of TIFIA, which is for transportation. This bill would create CIFIA, which is CO2 infrastructure finance and innovation. And that would provide the cost, the low cost financing component. What the modeling that many of us have done, and some companies as well, shows though, is that lower, even zero interest financing at the federal level is not enough for companies to build infrastructure bigger and ahead of demand. To afford to finance that extra capacity that won't be used right away, there needs to be a grant component. So this legislation includes a grant component to make sure that the initial infrastructure is oversized for future deployment and development and deployment. And then finally, there's a carbon utilization component as well that is beyond enhanced oil recovery. And like we have carbon capture test centers in places like Alabama and Wyoming and other places around the world, this bill would enable the creation of a carbon to value test center where carbon utilization technologies could be tested out and using captured carbon as a feedstock to produce fuels, chemicals, materials, etc. So those are the elements of the SCALE Act. I want to just point out that this has been an effort over months to fashion this bill with both congressional staff, with members from both political parties, and a whole range of stakeholders. The next slide. And so here are the kind of the next steps. The SCALE Act is going to be introduced tomorrow. Again, we have bipartisan sponsors that are ready to go. And we have a number of companies, unions, and environmental organizations ready to provide public support, quotes, media statements, and so forth. And so Patrice will be, or Lauren will be communicating with all of you on this webinar once the bill is introduced. And we have kind of two major requests of all of you. One is to please, once the bill is introduced and you have the materials from us, please reach out to members of your congressional delegation and do two things. One, emphasize to them the importance of CO2 infrastructure to your state and your region, and how it's crucial to have that be part of infrastructure policy in the new Congress. And then for those of you representing both the MOU states and the states on the webinar that are considering joining the MOU, if in a more formal way to bring this to the attention of your congressional delegations, it's always really powerful when state officials themselves bring this information to the staff of the members representing their state. You can tell them about what's going on with the MOU and in the interest that you have in building out this infrastructure within your own state and regionally. And then the other thing that we would encourage you to think about as you move forward in developing your work plan is consider as part of your work plan activities in support of the federal financing, cost share, and other policies that will be needed from Washington to actually enable you to fulfill the state priorities that you identify and begin to work on through this MOU process. So we're very excited about this. I'll stop here in the interest of time so that we can do Q&A. I also have some numbers about the authorization levels. Let me just say, without getting into the numbers, this bill includes very, very significant commitments in storage and CO2 transport infrastructure and so forth that can be very supportive of the things that you're contemplating in your states and regions.
Thanks, Brad. And so at this point, I think we'll open it up for questions for our speakers. And you're welcome to use the chat function. Jeff Brown, I think you tried to maybe ask a question or make a comment earlier, and you're certainly welcome to take yourself off mute and do that now if you have something to offer.
Oh, Patrice, I was asking Steve the $3 billion that he described for the Wyoming Energy Agency, whether that was appropriate or exactly what it was. And what that is authorization for WEA to issue bonds, backed by its own credit and projects assembled. So that's not a state of Wyoming appropriation or guarantee. So it's sort of a traditional municipal agency type funding. But I did have one question. Brad, I sent it to you in the chat, but I wondered if there's any thought in the next couple of years of, more of the heavy industry type grants or cost sharing programs like the ones that really haven't been done since ARRA in 2009, when we had the industrial carbon capture grants that funded Decatur and the air products, carbon capture, methane reformer.
Well, so the short answer is yes, I'm quite confident that will be the case. The interest level is enormous and it's widespread. And I think it's fair to say that the leadership at DOE Fossil Energy is very, very interested, has been throughout this administration interested in industrial carbon capture, but there's not necessarily been support from the administration more broadly. It's come from Congress, and the problem is, you mentioned the stimulus bill, the ARRA, in 2009. Since then, there hasn't been any significant federal support. So the challenge, in a sense, is that we're kind of starting. It's not fair to say from zero, but I don't remember the levels, but the current round of appropriations bills includes some specific industrial funding that wasn't there before. It's a step forward, but it's still very small scale. But the politics on this are shifting enormously. I think the industries themselves realize that they need a path to decarbonize, yet they're in very low margin, trade exposed industry sectors. And those costs of decarbonization and the technology investments can't be borne in the marketplace in terms of the price of the commodities they produce. So I think there's growing consensus that there'll need to be research and development dollars and incentives rather than regulation to start that transformation on the industrial side.
Thank you very much. That's perfect, because it's so important.
It is indeed.
Thanks, Brad. Are there other questions from webinar participants for our panelists or speakers? I was just taking a look through the chat and I'm not seeing anything unanswered there. Okay, well, I would like to thank again our speakers today for sharing their presentations with us. And just as a reminder, the fourth and final webinar in this learning series will be held next Thursday, December 17th. And we will be talking about the potential elements of the action plan and the work plan for 2021. So with that, thank you all for joining us today and have a wonderful Wednesday.